Will injecting a weak acid such as lime juice, citric acid, or lactic acid into your brisket improve the quality of your brisket and make it more tender and juicy? We're gonna find out in this experiment, so let's get smoking. Recently, I was reading a meat science textbook called Lowry's Meat Science 9th edition, and I found that it had a really good summary of a collection of studies that have been done that involved injection brining meat with various weak acids, such as citric acid, vinegar, lactic acid. There's even been studies done where they inject soy sauce and test the tenderness of the meat after they brine it and then cook it. And they actually do scientific analysis with a shear test machine to scientifically measure the toughness of the meat. And they've categorically found in all of these studies that yes, the injection of a weak acid into meat actually makes it more tender. So that kind of got me thinking, what if I could inject some weak acid into a brisket? Would that make it more tender? Would it make it more juicy? In a lot of these articles, they talk about the mechanism for how the meat gets more tender with the injection of weak acid, and it involves the shifting of the pH of the meat. It lowers the pH of the meat to around, I think meat is around 5 or 6 in average pH, to around a pH of 2. And because that pH is so acidic, it affects the protein, and more particularly and more interestingly, it affects the collagen intramuscular tissue between those muscle fibers. It weakens them, it denatures them, and it causes them to render at a lower temperature, which is really interesting to me because I'm really big into finishing brisket at a lower temperature and holding it for a longer period of time to finish it so we can get more beef flavor, we can get more juiciness, and we don't take the meat up to a 200 degrees plus temperature, which really denatures the meat and affects the water holding capacity of the meat. So for this experiment, because there's so many variables, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sacrifice this brisket here. It's a choice grade brisket that I got from Costco. I'm gonna cut it up into cubes or strips, and then I'm going to inject it with various weak acids of various concentrations. I've got lactic acid, I've got citric acid, and I'm doing lime juice for this experiment. So let's open up this brisket and I'll cut it into strips. I'll speed it up for you guys, and then we'll get right to the injection part of this experiment. Guys, before we start injecting brisket chunks with acid, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon is cereal reinvented for adults. It's the same great taste that you remember growing up, but it's upgraded with grown-up ingredients and nothing artificial. When I'm looking for a quick breakfast, I reach for Magic Spoon because it's high protein, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, wheat-free, and naturally flavored. And possibly the best part of it is my 2-year-old son absolutely loves it, and we can eat together for breakfast every day instead of some sugary breakfast option. It has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs in each serving, with just 140 calories per serving. And they also have cereal bars, which are really good as well. I actually eat 2 of them as a post-workout meal because they have just 1 gram of sugar, 10 grams of protein, 4 net grams of carbs, and just 130 calories per bar. So they're helping me on my journey to become a swole barbecue dad. Click the link below to get some Magic Spoon cereal today. You can build your very own variety box and use my code STBBQ for $5 off. You can choose from the best-selling cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, and maple waffle flavors, plus other awesome flavors including honey nut, blueberry muffin, birthday cake, and cinnamon roll. You can also add the cookies and cream and cocoa peanut butter cereal bars to your variety box. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code STBBQ for $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/STBBQ to save $5 off your order today. Also, for my Canadian and British fans, Magic Spoon also ships to Canada and the UK. All right, let's get back to the video. All right, so I've cubed up this entire brisket, first separating the point from the flat, and then I cubed up all the flat and the point slices. For each injection, I'm going to do 1 point chunk and 1 flat chunk, just so I can get a good idea of all of the muscle tissues of a brisket and see how the acid breaks them down. There's obviously much more interconnective tissue in the point than in the flat, so it could skew the results if I only did one or the other. So now I'm going to start with the 21% lime juice solution. So I squeezed out some fresh lime and then I diluted it in water to a dilution of 21%. This is going to be a lot higher than the other weak acids I'm using because lime has a much lower percentage of citric acid than pure citric acid, obviously. Lime juice is made up of mostly water, so that's why we're diluting it to such a high percentage. So I'll fill this injection needle up, and then I'm going to inject one of these slices of the flat, or chunks of the flat. Woo! That's squirting quite a bit. So that's a chunk of the flat, and now I'm going to do a chunk of the point. Okay, and now that this is fully injected and it's sitting in the solution, I'm going to cap it off. And this is going to marinate and brine, if you will, for the next 24 hours. The second injection I'm going to do is the 10% lime juice solution. So this is basically like the other lime juice injection I did, but it's only a 10% dilution ratio. The second set of weak acids that I'm going to use is the citric acid. So I've got a 4.5% solution of citric acid here. Citric acid is used in a lot of food. It's in candy like Sour Patch Kids. It's used in barbecue rubs, and it's naturally contained in things like orange juice and lime and lemon. So I think it's a pretty natural ingredient that would go well in brisket if used at a low enough concentration level. It wouldn't ruin the taste too much. And it was also used in a bunch of these studies that found that citric acid actually did increase the tenderness of beef. So that's why I'm doing it. So 4.5% solution of citric acid, 1% solution of citric acid in case the 4.5% is way too heavy. And for the last set of weak acid, I'm using lactic acid. I picked this up on Amazon. It's 88% lactic acid by LD Carlson Company. It lowers the pH in mash for brewing. Some people use it on their face. It's used in a bunch of foods. So again, it's a pretty natural ingredient. It's food safe. It's not going to harm you in low enough concentrations. So this is a 4.5% solution. And actually 4.5% is what they used in one of the studies that found that the 4.5% solution did have an impact on the tenderness of the beef. They didn't say it was 4.5. They said it was 0.5 moles of lactic acid per liter of water, but I did the calculations and I found that to be about 4.5% lactic acid diluted in water. So we got 4.5% lactic acid, and we have a 1% solution of lactic acid. So those are all of the acids that we're going to test. I'm going to inject them all. I'm going to leave them for 24 hours, and then we'll move on to the next step of the experiment. All right, all of these chunks of brisket have been brining in the acid solution for 24 hours. So I'm gonna remove them, and I'm gonna put them in individual sous vide bags that look like this. I'm going to put the two chunks in one bag. So there's two chunks in this one. So I'm going to cook them together in one bag. And so that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bags total that I'll be testing. I don't know the sous vide temperature or time that I'll need to cook these chunks at to get them to tenderness. There's a chance I could overshoot it and make them all super mushy and overcooked, in which case I won't be able to detect any tenderness difference at all. Or I could undercook all of them and then they'll be super tough because the collagen hasn't had a chance to render at all. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use some extra chunks of brisket that I have here, and I'm going to sous vide these chunks of brisket in a couple of sous vide bags, and I'm going to cook them at 180. So I'll cook everything at 180 in the sous vide, and every 2 hours I'm going to remove a chunk of the control brisket out, and I'm going to test it for tenderness. And when I get to the point where these control brisket chunks are just at the point where they're kind of edible, they're not too tough, but they're also not overdone, that's when I'm going to pull the rest of the experimental sous vide bags out, and I'll start the test. All right, guys, I took these pieces of brisket to the point where they were just kind of a little bit tender, but still a little bit tough. They weren't probe tender yet because I want to get a good idea of the ones that are still tough and the ones where the acidity actually helped and made them more tender. So we're going to start out with the 10% lime juice. I'll give this a slice against the grain, and I'll pull it apart. It's pulling apart about as easily as the control brisket. I can taste a hint of acidity, but otherwise it doesn't really taste that bad or that good either way. I'll pull this piece of the flat apart. Pulls apart pretty easily, about as easily as the control brisket. It's got a little twang of lime, but otherwise I don't really taste a difference, and it doesn't seem like it made much of a textural difference at all. So let's try the 20% lime brisket. I'll give this a slice. Again, against the grain, this is into the point. Pull this apart. It's pulling apart about as easily as the control brisket. Still got a bit of tug. Let's give it a taste. Again, there's a little hint of lime on the 20% lime brisket, but I don't think it made much of a tenderness difference, and I don't think it made much of a taste difference. So let's move on to the citric acid brisket. This is the 1% citric acid brisket, so I'll start with the what looks like the flat. I'll get a slice. Pull this apart. A little bit more tender than the control brisket. Oop, it's kind of hot. Slightly more tender than the control brisket. Actually, that slice was a lot more tender. Very acidic to the point of being inedible. Doesn't taste very good, but it is a little bit more tender than the control brisket. So now I'm going to do the 4.5% citric acid brisket. I don't know why I'm doing this. I guess I just like to torture myself. It's obviously going to taste like garbage. Okay, so right away I can tell that this 4.5% citric acid brined brisket is going to be a lot more tender. It's almost like it's dissolving. So let's go into the flat here. So the muscle fibers are shredding. Give you guys a close up there. And it's pulling apart like nothing. So much, much, much more tender than the control brisket. So this definitely does something, guys. We have proven that brining in an acid definitely increases the tenderness of a brisket. The only problem is it doesn't really taste very good after you do it. So let's pull that apart and give this a taste. Oh, God. Yeah, I had to spit it out. Not very good. Very acidic. The fat is kind of disintegrated and acidic and gross. So whatever it's done to the fat is pretty nasty. The muscle fibers taste okay. A little bit acidic, but the fat is just gross. Let's go into the point here. It's almost overdone. It's overcooked. I would consider this brisket well overcooked. We'll pull this apart. Yeah, it just pulls apart like nothing. So this 4.5% solution of citric acid has basically melted the collagen at a much lower temperature than normal. Okay, so for the final test, we're going to test out the lactic acid brined brisket. So this is the 1% lactic acid brined brisket. So let's cut into the flat here. Pull it apart. It's pulling apart about as easily as the 1% citric acid brine brisket. A little bit more tender than the control brisket, but not by much. Cut into the point. It's pulling apart pretty tough still. Pretty much the same as the control brisket. And surprisingly, it doesn't taste terrible. It tastes way better than the citric acid brined brisket and the lime juice brined brisket. So I think we're onto something here with the lactic acid, guys. Let's see if the 4.5% brined lactic acid brisket tastes any better or worse, or if it's any more tender. So this is the 4.5% brined lactic acid brisket. There's the flat, there's the point. Ugh, doesn't smell very good. And look at the fat, guys. The fat just kind of like, it's melted. So that acid has broken down the fat quite a bit. It already feels like it's overcooked. I'll pull it apart. Pulls apart really easily. So very similar to the citric acid brine brisket. It's kind of mushy. This huge chunk pulls apart easily. I really don't want to taste this, but for the sake of science and for you guys, I will do it. No. I almost threw up there. That was really gross. So what I can say definitively is that this 4.5% lactic acid solution and the citric acid solution definitely makes the brisket more tender. You could probably take it to a much lower temperature and finish it that way, but it makes it taste like absolute garbage. So it's a catch-22. I don't think I would trade the taste for the tenderness in this case, though. I will try a piece of the point, though. So we'll pull this apart, pulls apart really easily. God. Yeah, just really gross, really inedible. Would not feed that to my worst enemy. And finally, here is the control brisket, the last chunk of control brisket that I have. And I'm just going to cut this up just so I can double check that the tenderness is on point and I'm getting a good comparison. So we'll give that a slice. So here's a slice of the control brisket. Pulls apart a little bit too tough, so it's edible, but it's way undercooked for a brisket, at least ones that I like. You can still pull it apart, but I would not want to serve that up to my family. So that gives you a good idea and comparison. This is how tender the brisket should have been. Pretty tough. And when you saw me taste those other chunks of brisket that had been brined in the acids of various concentrations, they were a little bit more tender. All right, guys, we fast forwarded a couple days into the future. I had to take a couple days to think about the results of that last experiment because I didn't really get what I was looking for. We did demonstrate that you can tenderize the brisket, break down the collagen, the fat, the muscle tissues with a higher concentration of acid injection, but it renders the brisket absolutely inedible, tastes like doggy doo-doo poo-poo. And even at the lower concentration of 1%, it didn't really taste that great, and I couldn't really tell if it had done anything at that concentration. So what I'm gonna do now is a test where I brine the brisket chunks for 2 days and 3 days. So I'm using a lower concentration of lactic acid at 0.5%, and I'm doing it for a longer period of time to see if the lower concentration can get the same results as the higher concentration by having a lower concentration but doing it over a longer period of time. I also chose to focus on lactic acid and pretty much eliminated citric acid because I didn't like the flavor of the citric acid or even the lime juice. And I did some research online, and citric acid and lactic acid is often used for sausage making and fermenting meat. And a lot of professionals prefer the lactic acid because it has a better, more complementary, subdued taste. The citric acid tastes kind of a little bit too acidic. So I'm concentrating on the lactic acid, 0.5% solution. I've got some brisket chunks in these 2 jars. I'm gonna refrigerate them for 2 days. Then I'm gonna cook one the same way I did those other brisket chunks. And then I'll wait an additional day for 3 days total, and I'll test this one and I'll see what the results are. All right, guys, it is 5 days later now. I did the 2 and 3 day brining test. I'll put it up on the screen here. In the first test, the 2-day brine test, I didn't have any results. It was just as tough as the control brisket. But in the 3-day test, I had some really good results. I cooked it at 180 degrees Fahrenheit in my sous vide for about 6 hours. And when I tested the injected brisket versus the control brisket, the injected brisket was a lot more tender and it pulled apart, and the collagen seemed to have rendered a little bit better than the control brisket. So we're making some headway here, and I realize this is kind of a long-winded experiment, but that's kind of what science is. It's kind of figuring out all the things that don't work so you can figure out the one that does. So what I found is the 0.5% brine solution with the lactic acid is the solution and percentage and type of acid that has the best taste, and it actually does something. You just have to leave it in the brisket for a longer period of time. So what I'm gonna test now is an actual brisket. I'm going to inject it with 1,000 milliliters of 0.5% lactic acid solution. I'm going to brine it for 3 days, and then I'm gonna cook it normally and see if it's more tender than the control brisket. And for the control brisket, I'm also going to inject it with water, 1,000 milliliters of water. I'm also gonna vac seal it, leave it for 3 days, just to keep everything consistent. All right, guys, it is game day. It's time to smoke these 2 briskets. This one has been brining for the past 3 days in the acid solution, and I have my control brisket, which was just sitting in the water. It was injected with just plain water. So I'm gonna take these out of the cryovac bags, or not cryovac, they're vac seal bags. Now for the rub, I'm gonna be using some Christy Vanover's brisket rub. Vanover's, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Christy. I got this from Spiceology. It's a really tasty brisket rub. It's got some really nice flavors in it. I think there's a lot of chili flavors, and I was tasting cumin. I could be wrong, but it tastes really like kind of a chili-based rub. Really liking it though, it's pretty good. All right, let's start with the control brisket and give it a little sprinkle. Sprinkle, 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 sprinkle. Okay, these briskets are rubbed, so we're gonna let them sit on the counter for about 30 minutes to absorb all that rub, and I'm gonna head out to light up the smoker. For this cook, I'm gonna be using Big Beefy Luigi, my Yoder trailer smoker. I haven't used him in a while because I've got this robin's nest up here in the rafters, or what do you call that? That's the gable end. At the top of the gable end of my garage, there's this robin's nest, so I was afraid of killing them or something by lighting a fire down here and having a bunch of smoke go up there. But it appears they've abandoned their nest, so they're gone. I'm not afraid of getting dive bombed or killing any birds anymore, so I'm gonna use this thing. The other reason I haven't used this in a while is because, to be honest, I don't really like the way it cooks. It's kind of a antiquated design where it has the baffle plate underneath with the different holes of increasing size as it goes towards the stack. And the problem I have is that even though you can open up this small little vent here to get more convection over top of the briskets, you also have the double problem of having the stack at the top of the chamber, so it doesn't really come back down. There's a big cold spot down here, so I can cook one brisket here, but if I'm cooking two, I'll have one below here, and it doesn't cook as fast as the one up top. And if I put it over here, it's too hot, so I think I need to do some modifications on this smoker to be happy with it, but we'll see. That's a project for another day. I'll just live with it for now while I cook these two briskets. So let's light up this firebox with my grill gun. If you guys don't have one yet, highly recommend getting one. There's a link in the description section below. Lights a fire in less than 60 seconds. So much more convenient than using a chimney starter. And as a bonus, I can also use it as a weed burner. All right, guys, it's been about 30 minutes. These briskets are looking good. A lot of the salt has absorbed onto them. So I'm gonna put them on the smoker now, which has been preheated to about 250 degrees. And with these guys on now, I'm going to check back in probably around 3 or 4 hours just to see how they're doing and if they need a spritz. Then after that, I'll ramp up temps to 275 to 300, and then we'll take them all the way up to 190 degrees internal. All right, guys, it is the next day, and I have both briskets lined up side by side. I have the control brisket here, and I have the acid injected brisket here. So we're gonna cut into the control brisket first and see how tender it is. Let's cut it from this angle here. Give it a slice right down the middle. And I'll give you guys a quick look to see how juicy it is. Here we go. That's a good one. Okay, I'll give you guys a look here. Looks pretty nice. So the point on top of here, let's pull that apart. It's pretty decent. And the flat, yeah, the flat is perfectly cooked. So let's take a bite of it. It's a pretty tasty brisket. I'm happy with the way it turned out. It's not really that tough, and considering we pulled it at 180 degrees instead of 190, and it probably spent maybe an hour less on the smoker than my normal briskets, that's pretty good. And it goes to show that that long hold at 150 for 18 hours, it really evens out all the toughness, and even if you pull your brisket a lot earlier, you can still save your brisket. It's good. It's a really good brisket. I got no complaints with this one, so I'm interested to see if the acid-injected brisket is going to be any more tender than that one. Let's slice into this guy. Right about, yeah. Whoa. That looks kind of weird at first glance. It looks like a little bit more white on the top of the point. Not quite sure what that means. Maybe the meat got more denatured or something. Smells okay. So let's get some tallow on this guy. And we'll take a super awkward slice of the flat. I'll give you guys a look. Looks kind of similar to the last one. Let's pull the point first. Pulls a lot more easily than the control brisket, and the flat pulls apart effortlessly. Let's give it a taste. Hopefully it doesn't taste like garbage and I puke all this out, but yeah, here's hoping. It's actually quite nice. I don't taste any of that harsh acidity. Maybe a little bit, but it actually complements the brisket. It adds a little bit of acidity to the background. It actually tastes really good. And it's more tender than the other one. I'm gonna take a slice from the point now. A couple slices actually. This point is slicing a lot easier than the control brisket point. So I think it's also gonna be more tender. So I'll give you guys a look. It's got a little bit of weird discoloration in the seam fat there. I'm not quite sure if that's from the acid injection. The fat is decently rendered. I probably could have done a better job rendering that fat cap a little bit more. That's kind of my smoker a little bit though, and partially my skills. So we'll pull this apart. It's pulling apart pretty easily. I'd say about the same as the control brisket. Let's give it a taste. It tastes really good. Again, that acidity from the lactic acid is very subdued. You can barely taste it. You do get a hit of it. I think if you know what you're looking for, you might kind of notice it, but to someone just eating this brisket, I don't think they'd notice it. So what's my conclusion for this video? Does injecting acid into your brisket actually do anything based on these tests? I would say 100% yes, it does tenderize your brisket, but the concentration of acid that you need to inject into your brisket to actually do anything to make it more tender makes it virtually inedible. The brisket chunks that were injected with a really high concentration of acid got really mushy, they tenderized, but they taste like absolute garbage. You couldn't serve them to anyone. And the brisket that I injected with the 0.5% solution of lactic acid, it did do something. It did a little bit of tenderization, I think, but it was barely enough to notice. But the plus side was that I couldn't taste any of the lactic acid and the brisket was actually edible. So could you inject smaller concentrations of acid into your brisket to make it more tender without noticing the taste difference too much? I would say yes, but is it worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? I would say no. But let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. Are there any other types of acids or other weird things that I could try injecting into a brisket to try to make it more tender? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm always interested in doing new experiments. If you want to get more involved in the Smoke Trails barbecue community, as always, you can join my Patreon. I'll link it in the description section below. We got an awesome community there, and I get a lot of my ideas from that community. And I want to thank everyone that is part of my Patreon community, because if I'm struggling with an idea and I don't quite know which direction to go, the brain trust on Patreon usually steers me in the right direction. So thank you, Patreon supporters. You make this channel better. You can also follow me on Instagram. You can join the Smoke Trails Barbecue Nerds Facebook group, or you can just like and subscribe and leave a comment below. It all helps the channel. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Happy smoking.